Hello and welcome. I am Barbara Kolmosh. I'm an ed consultant in the Center for Teaching and Learning. And Jacqueline, you can introduce yourself.
Yes, I am Jacqueline. I am a learning design intern with the Center for Teaching and Learning.
And today we are going to be talking about developing course learning outcomes. Okay, I'd like to acknowledge that we are located on the unceded territory, the Okanagan peoples. Those of you who are on campus are familiar with the artwork that we lovingly call the story poles. And this was gifted to us by CLO artist Les Lewis. And he really wants people to be interested in creating their own story and thinking about what these symbols mean. So we are not on our campus today, but when you are, think about the story that you are creating through your work with your students and faculty members if you're working with faculty. So thank you for being here today. So I'd like to start with an observation that I came across, that learning outcomes are only good as the conversations they generate. So this is a starting point. The idea is that your learning outcomes will evolve, and the more you talk to others, your colleagues and your students, then you'll better understand ways to improve them. Okay, so today our hope is that you'll be able to explain in your own words what is a learning outcome, what isn't a learning outcome, and how they're useful, particularly at the course level, but we'll also touch on at the program institutional level. Describe the difference between program learning outcomes and course learning outcomes, and consider how they should be connected. And then you're going to engage in the development of individual CLOs through constructive alignment. And we're going to be thinking about learning taxonomies or frameworks for you to think about what students, how you envision students learning in your course. And then you will be able to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of course learning outcomes in different disciplines and academic programs. So let's start with some definitions of when we're talking about learning outcomes. You may, probably have heard about your institution. Our institution has a mission. It's more visionary, kind of at the very top. And then we have a general term of goals that we want for our learners, that either at the institutional level or at the program level. Of course, there are standards that are external, that the ministry or an accrediting body puts forth. And then objectives, which I'll talk a little bit more about, but these are general learning goals that are associated with specific topics or activities that support the learning outcome. So I'll come back to that. Attributes, we usually hear them with respect to describing traits of graduates. Like these are the attributes that we would like our graduates to have. Competencies combines knowledge and skills. So sometimes they're also used to describe graduates of a program, their competencies. And then outcomes, what we're going to be working on today, we would like these to be the demonstrable and measurable knowledge and competency values in a course. So we will break two of those down a little bit further. But here's here's a definition of learning outcomes. So concise statements that describe the essential knowledge, skills, and or abilities that students should possess upon completion of a course or program. Okay, and so this could also include dispositions, if that's also important in your course. All right. So the questions that maybe you're asking about your learners in your course are my students learning what I'm teaching? And basically, you're teaching, and you're like, are they learning this? How do I know? And then can they apply what they're learning to different contexts? That could be probably important to you. And then how do they understand the key concepts I'm focusing on, right? Before they can move on to the next level or if they can graduate. So these may be key questions that you're asking yourself. And so keep those in mind as we talk about objectives and outcomes. So here's an image of a woman drawing back her bow to hit a target. And so I'm going to use this image to talk about the difference between an objective and an outcome. So her objective is to hit the target. Okay, that's the objective. And so she may have to practice certain times, a certain number of times a day, learn about positioning, how to hold her shoulders, right? There may be many tasks involved in meeting that objective. So the outcome is whether she hits the target in the yellow, maybe a certain number, maybe 6 times out of 10, maybe that is the outcome. And then we can call her that she has a certain competency in archery. Okay, so if you think about the objectives, there could be many things that she learns how to do with her stance, with her shoulders, whatever it may be, how she holds the bow and arrow. And then the outcome is actually, is she able to hit the target a certain number of times. So maybe that helps with understanding how those two are used, even though many people will use objective and outcome interchangeably. So be aware of that as well. But I'm going to be, Jacqueline and I will be using outcome in this way. Okay, so here's an example of an objective versus a course outcomes. So I teach college writing, so my examples are from college writing. It could be that the purpose of the course, right, is to train learners to read text carefully, critically, expose them to interactive nature of university classroom through discussions, and hone their abilities of a writer at the university level, right? It's kind of what the purpose is of the course, but it doesn't speak to what they will actually be able to do by the end of the course. So the last 3 bullets focus on the outcomes, that they'll be able to infuse writing with stylistic features that reflect voice and personal and cultural values. They'll actually be able to do that. Employ written rhetoric as a means to advocate for change. This could actually be rewritten to be more precise and more measurable, that they will be advocating for change using written rhetoric, right? Because that's kind of the focus. Articulate how American Indian peoples have used oral and written discourse as advocacy. So this is what they'll be able to do. So hopefully you could see the difference in the focus. Even though the objectives are part of the course, they're not the outcomes. All right, so as you're thinking about learning in your course, and we had those questions up earlier about what do you think your students know, if they can apply the knowledge in certain contexts. So maybe that you have some evidence of that you already know that you're collecting. If, for example, it's important for you for them to develop oral presentation skills, and then you're having them self-evaluate and their peers are evaluating them, then you have some measure of their oral presentation skills. Similarly, if problem solving is important and they're working on homework problem sets, and then they're doing some think alouds to verbalize them working through those problem sets, then you're understanding, right? They're able to demonstrate to you the extent to which that they're acquiring those problem solving skills. And then integration of ideas, if you're asking them to reference multiple sources and you co-created a rubric with them, then you have some sense. At the same time, you may not be sure about their ability to apply knowledge to troubleshoot problems if you're giving them only multiple choice exams. There's like a disconnect there. And if you want to know if they can communicate concepts to various audiences, but then you're the only instructor evaluating their essays, then there's another disconnect there. Same thing for interpreting data in context. If there's no context, it's just the textbook and no real life problems, then again, there's a disconnect. So there may be certain questions that you have about learning But what is important to focus on are these things that you actually want them. What is it that you want them to do? And then we talk about constructive alignment to make sure that they are connected. Okay. So it's important when you're thinking about learning and your expectations through the outcomes that you're explicit about the goals. And you need to ask how well the students are achieving the goals, and then you use that to make improvements, right? So if you think they're not learning, obviously I can tweak it. I can tweak my assessment, my assignment. I can add certain activities to make sure that they are learning what I want them to learn by the end of the course. Okay, so just a little, we're going to go off a little bit to the side to talk about the big picture of where learning outcomes sit. You'll see that the CLOs are in the middle, right? Course learning outcomes are at the center. This is where learning happens, and it's important for instructors to capture that. And then program learning outcomes are at the next level, where you're connecting up to the program learning expectations and goals, and we'll talk about that. It could be, that your faculty in school probably already has also some strategies that are important. Then you have your degree outcomes for BS, BSc, institutional strategies, accreditation, and then the ministry standards that we all tie to. And everything gets a little bit more broader and broader and broader. And the idea is that it will be easy for your course learning outcomes to connect. And then the next level to connect. You're going to be the most specific at your level because that's where specific learning and essential understandings are happening. Okay, so that's a little visual for that. And then course learning outcomes, they could serve different purposes. Thinking back to the institutional program level, probably you've heard of curriculum mapping. It's something that your program may be already doing or have done, and then they want to see how all the courses connect and support the learning outcomes at that level. We will be sharing a link to the curriculum map, a website, if you're not already familiar with it. This is useful for transfer credits, for transparency, for industry, for students, as well, students who may be transferring from another institution. Okay, so for learners, they provide specific information about what they will learn in the course and be able to do. They can connect that to other courses they've had, right, in the program. And they can use it throughout the course for self-reflection and self-assessment. Like, to what extent am I understanding or able to do what the outcome is, the particular outcome that we're working on. So for you and for others in your program, it provides consistency so that it doesn't matter who is teaching that section or however many sections, or who's teaching a certain course a certain year, that the outcomes are the same. It helps to align the content, activities, and assessments, which I'll mention in terms of constructive alignment a little bit later. And you can also involve students in co-constructing what to emphasize in the course. If you say, these are the outcomes, how are we going to achieve them? You can give them some choice and some flexibility, empower them to contribute to their own learning in that way. Okay, so computer science, I'm going to give an example from computer science to compare the program learning outcomes to the course learning outcomes. So if we think about the computer science major, graduates will be able to apply computer science theory and software development fundamentals to produce solutions to real-world problems, right? So it's kind of general. We know it's theory, software development, and real-world problems, but pretty general. Now, if we look at a course within the computer science major, a project management course, you can have a course learning outcome that states that learners will be able to demonstrate use of project planning processes by developing core project plans, including schedules, budgets, risk matrices, and communication plans. So you see how we have some of this theory and developing fundamentals to solutions that's connected to the learning outcome above, but it's much more specific because it's talking about budgets and risk matrices, right? Much more specific to the course. Okay. So how do we go about developing our course learning outcomes? Okay. In your pre-work, hopefully you've already done this. You've identified existing PLOs and standards. You've gathered your syllabi and assignment handouts to kind of see what has been done before. There are other points here that didn't ask you to do, but it is important to get some input from students and colleagues, industry, if that's relevant. And then you can move to development. So today we're going to be identifying expected learning, like deliverables associated with assessments, a little bit of that today, talking about taxonomies or frameworks of learning, and then using tips to draft CLOs. But there's other aspects of this process in here that you may or may not have already done. And then, of course, you'll have the implementation, but this is a recursive process. So you're going to come back to this as maybe your program is fine-tuning their learning outcomes for the program. Yeah, right, our courses are always changing, right? So depending on societal things happen in society, in the field, in the discipline, you might need to make some additional changes. So I just wanted to throw this out because maybe you think, oh, this is very different outside of my comfort zone. I don't have a background in education. How do I know if I'm developing learning outcomes correctly? But it's really the criteria used to create these measurable learning outcomes are similar to maybe some of the research questions that you have developed for your research. So when you design an experiment, right, and you want to address certain research questions. So for example, if we think about a plant that is thriving and doing well, and then we think about a plant that is not doing well, you may design an experiment to see how can I help my plant be healthy and thrive. Similarly, my students, how are they best going to learn what they need to learn to achieve those outcomes, to gain those skills, to gain that knowledge? And so we're putting forth, that dependent variable. We want that student thriving, right? And so what can we change? What is working and what is not working for them to achieve that? It was just another way of thinking about what we're doing. So constructive alignment, I mentioned that a little bit. This is not the typical diagram that you'll see with constructive alignment, more like a triangle of outcomes, assessments, and activities. But just kind of a fun example of if you have a dog and you think, oh, I want to be so fun, I can have my dog balance a ball on her head for 20 seconds. That could be an outcome that would be fun. Like when I go to the park, I could show off or enter a contest or whatever it may be. That's the outcome that I want. And then you think about how am I going to assess that? Well, a stopwatch, maybe not starting with 20 seconds, starting with, 4 seconds or 6 seconds, whatever it may be, to assess whether my puppy is achieving that goal. And then what are the activities? What kind of treats and pats on the head, and how am I going to consider when we're going to practice and how long we're going to practice? Like all those are considerations that go into the activities to support that when you're doing the assessments that your puppy is making some progress. So you want those 3 things to align, and that's pretty much what constructive alignment comes down to, very simply. So frameworks of learning for your pre-work, right? You watched a few videos on different hierarchical and non-hierarchical ways of thinking about how students learn. And maybe you're most familiar with Bloom's, right? Maybe Bloom's is the one that you're most familiar with, but there are many different ones. And you watched the videos about, I think you had one about significant learning, or there's Wiggins and McTeague, and also a little bit about the medicine wheel, right? So here's Bloom's taxonomy hierarchical with some definitions and some key verbs. I think, yeah, context is everything, right? And the verbs that they may write out to the side, don't get hung up on them, because there's been a lot of research done, and not everybody agrees that, for example, differentiate is at the analyzed level, right? So don't get hung up on whether the verbs align with the actual categories. And yeah, so don't rely on the verbs alone. Then the next one is the 6 facets of understanding. And as you say, this is not hierarchical, and it has certain categories like having self-knowledge and empathy that is not in the Bloom's taxonomy. So you really have to think about your discipline, your course, your learners, and the application of the knowledge and skills to figure out what framework of learning is would fit the best for you and your learners. Fink's taxonomy, where significant learning happens at the intersection of all of these areas. And again, we have different things than Bloom's, different aspects, different domains, like learning how to learn. And there's a human dimension and caring. And so really thinking about your discipline and what is important. And then Lefever's medicine wheel brings that indigenous framework, the indigenous concept of the medicine wheel. And Lefever has created around the physical, spiritual, emotional, and mental, these categories that you can kind of see how at the middle, they kind of come out to, I guess if you go in, it's more going deeper, right? You could start with honoring and valuing and connecting, empowering and self actualized. So you can kind of think as you move deeper, you're going into maybe higher order thinking and a little bit more complexity as well. So I'm going to share with you, with permission, that Fawad Najam created during a recent instructional skills workshop. So it's kind of like a mirror. He took Bloom's taxonomy, which is what he was familiar with at the top, and he inverted the triangle. And so it matches up. For example, like remembering mirrors internalizing. So if you remember something, is a little bit more superficial. And then if you can internalize it, then you definitely remember it. So it kind of mirrors that way, where through creation, you're also honoring potentially something. So it was his way of bringing together the medicine wheel and Bloom's taxonomy. So with this, I'd just like to point out that you don't have to choose one or the other. You can take bits and pieces of one framework and embed it, create your own framework. So you can get a bit creative with this. And you see, people have. All right, so we are going to really hone in now on drafting learning outcomes. I wanted to see if you had any questions at this time. No, or we're good? All right, so let's jump right in. Anatomy of a learning outcome. Okay, so this is how you actually write a learning outcome. They usually have a beginning sentence. Upon completion of this course, students will be able to, and then you'll have a verb like apply. And that's when I was referring to Bloom's taxonomy and other learning frameworks that can provide some useful verbs that align with the different domains. Okay, so you use something like apply, and then you'll have the content. So both APA and MLA style guides, okay, is what the students are doing. That's the content. Obviously, this is another example from my writing course. And then we'll have a little more context. And this is not always related to assignments and assessments, but it can be to kind of frame how is this happening, right? So here it says to format written assignments, including in-text citations and the reference page. So AP and MLA guides to format written assignments, I guess that could be more, encapsulated as the content. And then after that, the in-text citations reference page gives a little bit more of the context for that level of course. Okay, so we have a little video right now that I'm not going to start through here because it doesn't behave properly. I'm going to move out to, this is from the University of Alberta. So you might want to have a little scratch sheet out next to you. I'm going to pause at different points so you can kind of take a moment to, he's going to ask some questions and you can jot down some answers. So people have said that they found this video really helpful. So here it goes.
Broken into small parts. The first part is an accessible verb, something which specifies the desired student performance, justify. And the rest of it is the content area, the specific description of what that content target is. So if my verb is justify, in my mind, I think, could I go up to a student, not that I'm suggesting you would do this, but you go up to a student, you go, hey, you, justify. And they go, oh yeah, I can do that. Or, hey, you, explain. Hey, you, differentiate between, etc., etc. And now you wouldn't do it that way. I hope you don't. But in my mind, I think of that because if I say a verb that is not clear or doesn't give me the response I want, then it's not a good verb. But there are some you want to avoid. For example, no. Hey, you, no. Well, no what? You need to be more specific. So no is not the best verb to use. What is it you want them to know? That's what the verb should be. Another one to avoid is use. Hey, you, use. Now, it could be, for example, use this lathe. Okay, but how do you want them to use the lathe? To do what? What's the purpose of using the lathe? If it's a case of, I want you to be able to use a lathe safely, then the verb, you could be demonstrate. Demonstrate how to use a lathe safely. And then you can go, hey, you, demonstrate. Another verb to avoid is learn. Hey, you, learn. Okay, well, learn what? How do I demonstrate learn? Another verb to avoid is understand. Now, I realize this is a bit of a contentious one, but if you were to go to a student and say, you, understand, how do you demonstrate an understanding? Understanding is internal. If you're going to have an assessment of understanding, that has to be external. What is it they're understanding? How do they demonstrate they've understood something? And the other one is appreciate. Unless you have an applause-o-meter and you're going to have them applaud to demonstrate how well they've appreciated something, it's probably not the best verb to use. Let me give you a little bit of advice. It's very easy to try to just write these and to get a thesaurus out and just look through a list of verbs and pick the right one. And yes, while that can work, it's probably not the best way of doing it. The best way is to just to sit down and think and write it out without overthinking it. Just say, what do I want these students to learn? Never mind getting the language right. Never mind getting the verbs right. Just start with, what do I want them to learn? What do I want them to be able to do? And what do I want them to be able to think or have an attitude about? And the more you don't think about it, the more you just write it out or talk about it, the more those verbs will come out and then you'll recognize them. I promise you. Bloom's taxonomy can help you.
Okay, so I'm going to fast forward a little bit to an activity. Hopefully that was helpful to help you visualize how to go about constructing learning outcomes. And then he's going to talk about lower and higher domains. And of course, this is related to Bloom's. Not all the taxonomies or the frameworks are hierarchical, but the idea is that you don't want to just have students be at the lower in a domain that doesn't involve as much creativity or in-depthness. You want to have them build up to creating, to applying, to assessing, right? So I'll let him explain a little bit more.
Those three are considered lower order skills. They're good, but they're lower order. They're not super challenging. And let me give you an example. Here's a poem by Lewis Carroll. "'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave. All mimsy were the borough groves and the mom raths outbrave." It's a nonsensical poem. It doesn't make sense. However, lower order skills will still allow you to answer questions. And in fact, I bet if you were to be honest with yourself, if you were to go back in time to when maybe you were in elementary school, maybe high school, you were probably asked to read texts and answer questions, and you probably just skimmed through the text looking for the answer. And this is what lower order skills is all about. So for example, if I ask you the question, what were the slithy toves doing in the wave? What's the answer?
What were the slithy toves doing in the wave? What did they do? Can you tell? Can you guess, Jasmine?
Gyre and Gimble.
Yay, yes.
Yes, they gyred and gimbled in the wave. The answer is right there in the poem. Did you have to understand that? Not necessarily, but you found the answer. Here's another one. How would you describe the state of the borough groves? They were mimsy. And one more. What can you say about the mom raths? You can say they outgrave, whatever that means. So here's an example of questions which you could answer even if you don't understand what you're answering. Let's move on to the higher order skills. So we have analyzing. Consider the parts of something separately. So some good verbs to use here are analyze, describe, differentiate, organize, attribute, give reasons, or give causes and effects. So now we're having to think a bit more. And as we go up this ladder in Bloom's taxonomy, the next one is evaluating. Being able to judge something or to critically appraise.
Okay, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, just to the activity, because I think you could figure it out.
Now, thinking about those higher order skills, let's look at this poem again, and let's ask some higher order questions. Why were the borough groves mimsy? And we need to have a better understanding of the poem and the meaning behind it in order to answer that question. Higher order skills are necessary. Equally, how effective was the mom rath's strategy is another question you just can't answer because you need a higher order level of learning and understanding to be able to do that. Here are those 6 levels again. These 3 sections are low order skills, and these 3 are the higher order skills. Now, sometimes you will see this broken up into sets of 2.
Okay, we don't need to break it down so much and go so crazy. Just wanted to emphasize that it's not that higher order skills are better than low order skills, is that we need both, right? We need, whether it's hierarchical and you're looking at high and low, or you're looking at the different domains, you want to have learners be able to demonstrate their knowledge and skills from kind of easier to harder, from simpler to more complex, right? And not just do one or the other, regardless if it's a first-year course or a fourth-year course. So just wanted to point that out. Do you have any questions while I jump back over to the presentation? All right. So there we go. We're moving on. All right. So I have some tips for writing course learning outcomes, and I can share out these slides afterwards. So, all right. All right, some tips. So think of the different contexts and ways in which you like students to demonstrate what they know and can do. So do a little brainstorming. If you know what if your program has program learning outcomes, think about where your course fits. Is it expected areas of growth? In the course, is this mainly introductory course or is this more advanced? But either way, you're going to have developing different skills and different knowledge areas from introductory to advanced, right? But depending on the level, you may have more introductory or more advanced. So again, whether it's low and high order skills or all domains, if you're not looking at hierarchy, once you choose your domain, like, oh, I really love the medicine wheel and I want to choose these areas of medicine wheel that are super important that will reflect the kind of learning that I want to happen. So keep the statements short and limited to one outcome. Don't confuse what students are going to be doing every day or part of the lesson. Remember, we talked about the objectives of a course overall, like this is what you'll be doing versus what you can demonstrate as learning overall. Aim for about 4 to 6 learning outcomes, because all of those you'll be assessing and you need to develop some assessment plan around those. And it can be overwhelming if you have too many. And so try to condense it down into the essence. What are the essential understandings for that course? And then have kind of a little smart way, expanded smart to think about these. So student-centered, which I think is now hopefully clear, that it's what the learner is going to do and not what the instructor is going to do. State who, what, why something's going to be accomplished, just be specific. You're always going to be thinking about how can students demonstrate this? How can I measure the extent to which they are achieving this outcome? Be realistic. Like, is this really attainable in the context of the level and the scope of the course? Make the outcomes relevant to the program, degree, also the field, the discipline. Time bound, again, being realistic with the milestones and frequency indicators, end goal. Transparent, don't use any jargon or acronyms or things like that. And transferable. So how do these outcomes reflect what students will be able to do after they leave the institution and enter the workforce as well? Okay. So we're going to do a little activity now. Evolution of an outcome. All right, so we'll give you a second to think about this one. I have this draft outcome that I have written or that I've gotten from somewhere, and it's understand different interpretive approaches to the study of religious and literary texts. So let's say this is a course about the Hebrew Bible. Okay. So I'll give you a second to jot down, like, is there anything that you notice right off that you think, this is not very smart? We're going to have to revise this. What are your thoughts, Jasmine? What do you think?
Well, we shouldn't use understand as an action verb.
Right. It's not much of an action verb. Yep. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying it's hard to observe, so that's...
Yeah. Do you have a different verb that you'd suggest?
For this sentence, maybe identify.
Mm-hmm. Right. Identify different interpretive approaches. Depends on what the expectations are, right?
Yeah, how it's being assessed. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So let's look. Yeah, so recognize and identify are pretty similar, right? Recognize different interpretive approaches for studying religious and literary texts in the Hebrew Bible. So giving a little bit more context that this is a course on the Hebrew Bible, and that's what we're really limiting the scope to. And then anything else that you can think of like, is this the level that if the course is on the Hebrew Bible, would it be enough to just recognize the approaches?
I guess not. Maybe you want to apply it elsewhere.
Yeah, could be that you want a little bit more, that maybe you want to apply the different approaches when you're analyzing the religious and literary text in the Bible, right? That's what it's really about. Even though, like, definitely you need to be able to recognize the approaches or know what they're, know what they're about, be able to distinguish between them. But ultimately, that is included when you say you are going to apply. It's included that you're going to have to be able to distinguish between the different approaches and when to use them. Okay, good, great. Thanks for your input. Okay, so we have another set of 4 CLOs. So I was going to have you go to the Padlet that I created and work as a group on this, but I think we're going to skip that. Okay, and we can just work through these together. If you want to point out, what do you think is not as effective about with the first one? Become familiar with plant and animal species in the Okanagan.
It's not like an outcome, like to just become familiar with something is just like being exposed to something. You're not demonstrating really anything.
Right, it's passive, and then you're saying, yeah, how is that going to be demonstrated so that I can measure that you're really familiar, right? Okay. So let's look at that. Maybe we want to identify and describe is what it's about. And maybe you want to be more specific. 15 common plant and animal species found in the Okanagan wilderness area, right? And then you can add that piece that I said about the context, where you're already thinking about the alignment, that you're doing field study, and then you're going to develop an identification guide, and that's going to be your assessment. It's already in there. You don't have to have that, but sometimes it's good to think about it, because then you know that your activities and your assessments are going to be aligned. All right, let's take a look at the next one. Be taught various decision-making models. What jumps out at you as being not very smart?
It's not student-centered. It's like from a teacher's perspective to be
Right.
taught. It's also like pretty vague, various decision-making models. And I don't know, I feel like you would want students to use a decision-making model, or definitely it's not specific at all.
Right, not specific. I mean, let's say this is like a business course, right? So let's see, we can, as you said, use or apply. Sometimes apply is preferred to use. Some people say that use could be a little bit vague. I mean, I think don't get hung up on the verbs. If the use makes the most sense, right? Because you have what you're using, I'm not going to tell you not to use it. But we can apply. And maybe it's important to apply appropriate decision-making models, right? It's not enough they have to choose the correct ones to apply. And then again, we have participation in collaborative group projects. So we have kind of the activity / potentially assessment that's already kind of in my mind of like, how do I know when are they going to apply this? How are they going to apply this? I'm already thinking about that. Yeah, what do you think? Judge works of art.
That's missing like a lot of context and content. So, I mean, judge is technically an action word, but maybe like something about critiquing art and what kind of art and under what conditions.
Right. Getting the hang of this, right? Critique, maybe, being more specific. And then so how do you critique? Yeah, judge has that sense of judgment, values-based, versus critique that is based on a set of criteria, right? That is more helpful, that you're going to use this criteria to critique, and that here are the activities. There's going to be studios and independent essay. There's going to be different ways they're going to be doing that. Okay, the last one, appreciate the ethical responsibility of social scientists.
Yeah, we also shouldn't use appreciate at the beginning, because then we're measuring you can't really measure someone's appreciation for something, and it is like you were just saying, values based. I would change it to something appreciate the ethical responsibilities of social scientists. I like identify or something about the different ethical responsibilities.
Right, right. So maybe you're like, okay, sometimes you may have to rewrite quite a bit to get to what you want, right? But you're unpacking it really well. We're talking about ethical implications, it seems like, of research in the social sciences. So maybe you need to assess the implications of making this decision or over another. And then again, there's more context with the in-class discussion, independent written report. So it's not necessary to have those, but just showing how, again, that constructive alignment, thinking ahead. Great, super job. Thank you for helping with that. So now, ideas to draft or refine at least one course learning outcome. Okay, we could look at more than one. And to choose like one verb that you think, oh, this essential understanding could be best be demonstrated at this level. You know, this is why I want that verb. And then, yeah, if the drafting during that drafting refining process, definitely could capture kind of the niche of the course or some expertise. Definitely look toward what graduates need to do as professionals. And remember, we have that tips to draft and revise learning outcomes that I do have in the Padlet if we need. So, but I think since we're not a big group, we can maybe do this together. I have one other example here that we can look at really quickly about how this SMART tips aligns with, for example, of course, in the Italian Renaissance. So to be specific, right, identify and describe the political, religious, economic, and social uses of art in Italy during the Renaissance. It's very specific, right? The social uses has political, religious, economic, right? Measurable. Analyze the art of the period according to objective methods. You know, could be more specific, but maybe there's a lot of objective methods. Could be a little bit more specific there, but it's definitely measurable because they're specific criteria. Attainable, evaluate and defend the response to a range of art and historical issues. Okay. It's attainable within the scope of the course and the level of the students. Okay, relevant to compare and contrast the role of art of the artist in Italy during the Renaissance with those in contemporary society. So it's always relevant to bring something to the real world and the experience of the students and what they're going to be doing in their in the field and the discipline after they graduate. Time bound to link different materials and types of art to the attitudes and values of the Renaissance period. So it's not like all art is just within this Renaissance period within a certain amount of time. So there are some examples of that. All right, so I have lots of resources here that I can share it on the slides if you want to read more. And I think I have the link to that video if you want to watch all of it, right? From Alberta, University of Alberta. And I just want to thank you for joining today and providing all those draft outcomes that you're helping the instructor work on. So any other general comments, questions that you have about learning outcomes?
No, I think you covered it all. I haven't seen that University of Alberta video before though. That is pretty helpful. That like, hey you. I like that. I'm gonna use that.
Yeah. So it's a little goofy, but it sticks with people. That's what I've heard different faculty members say, like, oh, that video, you didn't show it this time. If they see it. Yeah, okay, I'll keep showing it until I do our own, right?
Mhm.
To keep in mind. So, well, thank you so much.
Of course,
Um,
thank you.
Yeah, feel free to, if you have questions and remember you have the handout also with example learning outcomes that you can take with you. And yeah, I know that they also have their program learning outcomes in computer science that they've developed, as you know. So they're not finalized, but they could be thinking about those different categories and see which ones they're hitting. So
Yeah, absolutely.
great. It's good to see you.
You too. Thank you so much. Stay safe.
Thank you. You too.
Okay, see you.
Bye-bye.